All right, everyone. Welcome again. Thanks for coming to our very last AIH seminar. And today it's my great pleasure to introduce to you our final speaker, Professor Seth Lazar, who is currently a professor of philosophy at the Australian National University, as well as an Australian Research Council Future Fellow, as well as a distinguished research fellow at the University of Oxford's Institute for Ethics and AI, and a fellow of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and a member of the executive committee of the ACM Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency Conference. He has worked very widely in the ethics of war, AI, risk, and he also currently leads right now the Machine Intelligence and Normative Theory, or MINT Lab, where he leads research in the philosophy of computing, funded by a bunch of places. For more information of his great work, please visit sethlazar.org. But for today, please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks for having me. Shall we just check, is the mic working okay? Yeah. So hi, everybody. It's lovely to be here to talk to you about this most cheery of topics. Now, one thing that I haven't been doing slides for a while. For a while, I just went hardcore on handouts. And I think this is because I was doing a lot of presentations to computer scientists, and I wanted it to be like a cultural experience for them. You know, this is how philosophers do it. You just get the handout and that's it. But I've started doing slides again recently, and I really wanted to try and figure out how to use generative AI creatively in making my slides. Now, you're going to see, before I just did this as an Easter egg thing, but these are all connected to a particular poem. And you're going to see as it goes along, and I'll talk about it a bit at the end. But okay, so what, if anything, should we be doing now about catastrophic AI risks? Let's start by setting the scene. So some of you, I think, have probably been kind of riding the tornado of AI news over the last couple of years, so this is all familiar to you, but just for those who are kind of seeing things more through the regular press rather than AI Twitter, let's talk a little bit about how in the last little while, AI capabilities have rapidly and radically advanced. Now, obviously, this has mostly been coming about through things like ChatGPT, large language models for generating text, but also for generating images, video, and audio. Just today, I saw the release of a couple of articles about creating fully synthetic representations of individuals. Reid Hoffman just put up a video interview of himself by an avatar of himself. It's kind of impressive. But besides these kind of just being able to generate images and text, these models have what are called, by some, emergent capabilities. So some fairly predictable ones like translation, and some unpredictable ones like the ability to use tools. So to produce function calls to different APIs for different pieces of software to augment the language model's capabilities. Also some degree of reasoning and planning. Stuff that really they shouldn't really be able to do, given that the way they're trained is just on next token prediction, right? So all you're doing is you're getting a ton of data, you're blanking out some of the data, you're trying to predict what will go there. How on earth do you then get these types of behaviors as a result? It's surprising. In general, they are much more performant, general, and much less toxic than preceding systems. The last bit is the reason why everything has changed. The actual difference between kind of GPT-3 and GPT 3.5, relatively speaking, is not massive as far as the actual kind of performance qua language model goes. The really big difference is that once you get to the launch of ChatGPT, you've actually got good methods for making sure that your language model doesn't go around saluting Hitler, which turns out to be quite important for productizing this stuff. People don't much like Nazi language models. The main reason this has come about is through applying massive amounts of data and compute. Some world-class systems engineering, if you look at the sort of people at the forefront of this. OpenAI, they've obviously made some really significant research breakthroughs, but the reason why ChatGPT and GPT-4 have been such a success has largely been about their systems engineering and their ability to put together a massive, massive training run. And then legit breakthroughs in alignment research. As far as the architecture goes, the main kind of innovation has been the transformer. This was introduced in 2017, so that's not kind of new, but it has been kind of fully extended and developed in lots of different ways. There are other architectures that are relevant. Selective state space models are going to be interesting. Over the last year, we've also seen other advances in terms of using transformers to attend to very long contexts. But the transformer is kind of key. Okay, late 2022 with ChatGPT, this really did break through to public awareness. You all are going to be very aware of this. So there was DALL-E in the middle of 2022. That was kind of a bit of a watershed moment. But ChatGPT was the thing that got everybody talking about all of this. Following this, there was a very well-funded and well-executed public relations campaign. It started by calling for a pause on AI research to enable societies to better get guardrails into place. I actually signed that one. My main motivation for signing that one was in order to be able to actually study GPT-4 and actually figure out what it was able to do before they introduce the next model, because it's just too fast. The pace of research, or pace of kind of producing these models is too fast to be able to understand their societal impacts. But then it led to a statement, which will be very familiar, I hope, to this audience, given that some folks were in the room when it was conceived. Mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal scale risks such as pandemics and nuclear war. This was signed by lots of people, including the CEOs of OpenAI, Anthropic, DeepMind, AI research leaders at Microsoft and Google, many researchers, including 2 have been credited with discovering deep learning. That's Hinton and Bengio. And over the course of the first half of last year, the Overton window for thinking about AI policy really did change. This extinction note was very widely covered by news outlets, really penetrated public awareness. There's been surveys done since, both of the US and the American population, and the Australian population, showing that people, are sort of they widely share this concern about the possibility of catastrophic risk from AI systems, like the general public that is. And it became central to public policy on AI, and actually injected some degree of urgency into an area that had more or less stalled out. So a little bit of kind of inside baseball. In the US, the AI Bill of Rights was kind of put through by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy in 2022. This was a sort of a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. It was not legislation. It was essentially a kind of a wish list document from the people in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, led by Alondra Nelson. There was a general sense that this was not necessarily going to lead to concrete action. In fact, there was at kind of various points, like even at FACT last year in Chicago, we put together a kind of a statement from FACT as well, basically saying, look, we have the research there to actually do kind of proper policy on this, but it wasn't quite happening. And like subsequent to this sort of PR campaign around catastrophic AI risk, there was a significant change, and the US White House issued an executive order on AI. There was an even more consequential Office of Management and Budget memo that I can talk about later. The EU AI Act ended up being kind of, the discussion of it at the end of the year ended up being dominated by questions around general purpose AI, but with, with Ursula von der Leyen talking about existential risks from AI at the podium in the European Commission. It was central to the UK AI Safety Summit and to the creation of the UK and US AI Safety Institutes. There were obviously people who were more skeptical about this. I wrote some stuff at the time about it, sort of arguing that it didn't constitute a risk on the sort of scale of urgency and importance as the other ones that were mentioned. Now, what I want to talk about today is the sort of like how to think about this in light of the fact that in the years since all of that took place, instead of these concerns translating into any kind of pause on AI research, surprise, surprise, they instead, we've seen a huge resurgence in AI R&D. There was actually a kind of a mini AI winter in 2022. Post ChatGPT, there's been a massive amount of investment. Things are slowing down slightly now. As well as OpenAI and Anthropic, you've got the 5 or I think actually 6 now that Apple are doing this. 5 of the 7 most capitalized companies in the world all have teams that are aiming for artificial general intelligence, which is the level of AI that is purported to pose such risks. There are a ton of new companies. I was just reading today that X.AI, the company that the director of Center for AI Safety, who penned that statement, is Chief AI Safety Officer for, or consultant at least. They are valued, they're going for a seed round of funding at something like $8 billion at a $16 billion valuation. Inflection, bit of a sadder story. They've been eaten by Microsoft. But Imbue, Magic, Adept, Character, lots and lots of other companies have raised billions in pursuit of this goal. And we've seen new models as well. So Gemini 1.5, particularly notable, Claude 3, various open models, Llama 3 was just released. So lots are coming for the GPT-4 crown. So what should we make of this kind of cognitive dissonance? Like, what should we think about the fact that on the one hand, a bunch of people have said, including some very distinguished computer scientists, that this technology, AGI, poses an existential threat, while on the other hand, everyone's just banging out, like it's become like the explicit goal of a bunch of companies. It wasn't the goal of Meta back in 2022. I don't know if you remember, there was this thing called the metaverse, which is quietly being not talked about anymore. But like, start of this year, Meta is coming all out saying we're going for AGI. That should give you pause. So what should we make of this? How should we think about catastrophic AI risk? But most importantly, what should we do about it? That's the real focus of this talk. What should we do now, if anything, about catastrophic AI risk? Okay, so this is how the talk's going to go. We're going to just cover a little bit of the kind of technical, empirical, and preliminaries, just to sort of level set for everybody. I'm going to talk about a couple of little moral philosophical points. They won't be super important, but they're worth covering. I'm going to make a proposal for how to think about catastrophic risk. I'll talk in terms of technological horizons. And I'm going to then talk about the challenges when you try to address risks beyond what I call the technological horizon. Then I'll talk about more promising strategies that we can take, and I'll finish just by kind of summing up what I think that we should be doing. Okay, technical, empirical, preliminaries. You'll get all the poem bits at the end. Does anyone recognize the poem yet? Any Yeats fans here? Yeah, no, we'll see. Okay, so what do we mean when we talk about this sort of advanced AI? So we don't want to get too hung up on specific the specific details necessarily of the kind of level that we're aiming at. The key thing is what kind of damage can we do? We don't need to get hung up on things like sentience, consciousness, true understanding and agency, whatever they mean. The thing that matters is capabilities, and functional capabilities are sufficient for causing any level of harm. So this is not a talk about when AI will kind of wake up and be sentient. It's just a talk about functional capabilities. Broadly speaking, AGI means performs at least most of the same cognitive functions as humans at human level or better, and likely some cognitive functions that human cannot. One of the problems with a lot of approaches to defining AGI is that they are very anthropocentric, which is probably not a good idea. But that just gives you a sort of a rough sense. It's not going to matter a ton. The real thing that matters is that these things can actually cause significant harm, and I think it's probably enough of that they're just sufficiently agentic. So it can perform long sequences of action without supervision to successfully realize some goal. That's probably what we're going to be looking at. What do we mean by catastrophic risk? Okay, this isn't obviously commonly defined. This is my kind of my way of interpreting it. I hope it's faithful to the kind of the discussion. So broadly speaking, I think it has a scope and a degree element. So the scope element affects everybody. Sometimes that's just used to describe societal scale. And very severe, so the degree element is just that it's really bad. So societal scale risk of severe harm. The canonical examples of this are things like supporting the development or manufacture of chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear weapons. AI worms, so self-replicating AI tools that are basically constitute malware or can deploy malware. And then obviously accidents along the lines of loss of control of AI in safety critical settings, and of course rogue AI, so the kind of the more sci-fi end of the set of problems. All right, first bit is like it's worth just starting with a little bit of cold water. Okay, so I'm not going to predicate a ton on this, but I think it is worth just recognizing that there are a lot of exaggerated claims about the capabilities of especially today's language models and where they might go next. So let's start with a little bit of cold water. So on the side of this sort of big worry that was a lot discussed at the beginning, the kind of the risk of LLMs for supporting the manufacture of CVRN weapons, the evidence so far is like same as with everything else. When you're using an LLM rather than using search, like maybe it's a bit better, but the information is all there on the internet anyway, so you can kind of do it anyway. And then as far as the kind of agentic capabilities of autoregressive transformer models, they're pretty good at simulating agency up to a point, no doubt about that. Especially in edge cases, however, the embers of autoregression kick in. So this is the idea that essentially what language models are doing when they seem to be reasoning is they're actually just doing pattern matching based on stuff from their training data. And that you can kind of reveal this, you can elicit this fact by taking whatever the kind of the test might be that they're being tested on and just kind of permuting it in various ways that would be kind of inconsequential to a human, to someone who can actually reason when considering that test, but which can often upset the LLM and make it not function as well. So just one example of this, if you get a GPT-4 to try to translate the ROT13 cipher, it does very well. So now the ROT13 cipher is you rotate the letter for each kind of word that you're trying to encode by 13 letters in the alphabet. You just shift to the letter that's 13 before it. If you do that, then it does very well. And the reason for that is that there's lots of examples of it in its training data. ROT12 is, as the name suggests, it's just rotate by 12 characters. It's not very widely used. There's very few examples of it in the training data, and GPT-4 performs much worse at that particular reasoning task than it does at the other one. So there's a number of examples of this, and I've got some papers that I can share with people who are interested. Some work by Melanie Mitchell, by Saurav Kambhampati, focusing on planning, about Subarao Kambhampati, and Saurabh Srivastava, focusing on kind of generalizing this to all of the reasoning benchmarks that are applied to language models. They're all basically showing that once you push these models out of distribution, they don't perform so well. And it's worth knowing as well, or recognizing as well, that in the last year and a bit, Google spent everything. They chucked the kitchen sink, a full org reorganization, massive amounts of resources at Gemini. And they came out with a model that is a bit better at vision, at the multimodal stuff. Has a longer context window, that's cool. But they haven't exactly kind of soared past it. And they do have all the data and compute in the world. So it's worth just sort of pausing and recognizing, look, we may well be near a plateau. On the other hand, just because there's a lot of hype doesn't mean that it's all hype. Okay? There is a lot of hype, but it's not all hype. It's worth recognizing that today's LLMs are just vastly more general than anything we had before. The standard, anyone who was teaching anything on AI or AI ethics up until 2022, the standard kind of way of introducing this stuff would be to say, well, we've developed very, very capable narrow AI systems like AlphaGo, but none of them, once they get outside of their kind of very specific task domain, if you even change the number of tiles that there are on the board in Go, or the number of squares there are on the board, not squares, but whatever it is on Go, then you completely mess it up, right? They're very, very narrow. They can't sort of adapt to different circumstances. And GPT-4 is really, really good at a really wide range of tasks. You can't kind of gainsay that. It is a really significant change. It's also worth saying that Rich Sutton's bitter lesson may well apply. So far, it seems as though existing autoregressive models do fail to generalize out of distribution, and they kind of struggle with kind of unseen permutations of kind of reasoning tasks. But maybe we'll just be able to give them enough data that doesn't matter. They'll never get out of distribution. Or maybe they will be able to kind of generalize from their training data in subsequent iteration once they're kind of sufficiently powerful. I just don't think that you can kind of bet that they won't. The bitter lesson of Rich Sutton's is essentially that in whatever area you think there might be some kind of ineffable human quality to the expertise that's necessary to achieve a certain level of performance, actually just apply enough data and enough compute and the right algorithms, and you'll kind of, you'll supersede whatever human expertise achieved. And I think it's also worth acknowledging that, through this year that we've had of looking at GPT-4 level models, and by the way, I'll share the slides at the end, so you don't have to photograph them all if you don't want to. You can just, I'll just give you the link. But we've had a year of seeing what the limitations of LLMs are, and creating systems, more complex systems that kind of backfill those limitations, right? So LLMs suck at planning, so we can combine them with, with planning systems. Even Subarao Kambhampati, who is the kind of main critic of LLM's capabilities as planning, has been developing approaches that kind of integrate LLMs with other automated planning systems in ways that can produce more capable complex systems. The fact that they can use tools is a really relevant feature here. Like they can call on different pieces of software in order to mitigate their weaknesses. So I don't think that we should just kind of like start out by just saying, it's all hype, don't worry about it. Like catastrophic risk is just another marketing strategy on the part of the AI companies to make you think that their models are more powerful than they are. We don't need to worry about it, right? I think that, you know, we definitely shouldn't just assume it's going to happen. It's uncertain, but like it's worth taking seriously what might happen if we have significantly more capable models. All right. So let's see whether we can kind of short circuit any of the discussion around catastrophic AI risk by just doing some moral philosophy. Like maybe if you hold certain views, then the questions about catastrophic risk are kind of foreclosed or they're opened up. I don't think they are, but I think it is worth pausing to consider this because the discussion of catastrophic AI risk has been so closely associated in the kind of popular press and in the kind of the general AI discourse with some particular views, especially long-termism on the one hand and a focus on extinction, a kind of big like focus on the importance of extinction risk on the other, which obviously go together but don't necessarily have to. Now, it's worth saying that the reason why long-termism is relevant here is not just because people are thinking that the risks from AI systems are going to happen in the distant future. It's because, according to long-termism, the thing that determines the value of any given action is the kind of the long-term future, the value of the long-term future. And in the case of a possible extinction threat, it's all of the value that would occur if that extinction event were to happen. And so the long-termist has a different view on the badness of extinction than a non-long-termist, even if extinction were to happen tomorrow, right? So long-termism is not kind of, people have kind of beefed with the long-termists on the basis that like, well, AI risk is happening really soon, this is not the right term for it. But like, that's not what long-termism is about. It's a thesis about the importance to our actions now of the value of human lives that are very distant from us in time. Okay, I think that we should reject long-termism and that we should be very careful about how we invoke extinction in our moral theorizing, but that this doesn't foreclose questions about catastrophic AI risk. Okay, so I'm just going to say very quickly why I think long-termism is bad. My main objections to it are just boring objections to consequentialism that haven't been answered. At best, they've been muddied. And the point is just that if you've got the vast value of the future to aim at or to preserve, then you know constraints and prerogatives that constitute common sense morality could have no real role to play. They would just be swamped instantaneously. Even in some of your most personal choices, like if you're deciding whether or not to have a child, you're not just deciding about the kind of, you know, the value of the life of your child. You're deciding whether or not to have a dynasty, you know, and all of those lives that go on into the future. Now, and actually, I think that if you're a long-termist and you're a utilitarian and a causal consequentialist, then I don't think you should really be upset by the prospect of human extinction. You know, this is a little cute, but like the fact is that future AI systems could definitely be much better than humans at converting resources into welfare. I don't know about you lot, but my average level of utility is definitely not kind of a huge amount, and I think that lots of people are pretty inefficient converters of resources into utility. The best route to a glorious long-term future would probably be to leave humans out of it. So I'm always surprised when long-termists are on team human. It just doesn't seem very consistent. Of course, you don't have to be a welfarist or a causal consequentialist if you're a long-termist, but like once you start rejecting welfarism and causal consequentialism, so once you become like a more sophisticated consequentialist, in order to open the door for common sense morality, then like long-termism just in general becomes much less appealing. Like if you're going to open the door to common sense morality, then let's also open the door to like priority for kind of relationships of justice among people who actually exist at the same time. Like it's not like once you open that door, like the force that pushes you towards long-termism is kind of the conceptual power of these very simple moral premises around the value of human lives and the sort of how you evaluate the consequences of your act. Once you reject those, then like there's just no real reason for long-termists. I don't really understand it. I also think that the focus on extinction is a bit dodge. So partly I think that this is a sort of sociological observation. I think for a lot of people, and especially for computer scientists, the reason why they like the focus on extinction is because it means you don't have to worry about substantive disagreement about political questions. Like surely everyone can agree that extinction would be bad, right? You know, which is It's fine, but not a reason to make that the basis of your moral theory. I think, look, there are a couple of slightly petty points. Like I think that, some communities face existential threats, like threats to the community that exists through time. Already, species extinction, I'm not sure whether it's qualitatively different. There's a bunch of work on this one can read. I also think there is something a bit icky about the notion that you focus only on risks that will also affect you rather than on much higher probability risks that will affect people who aren't like you. But I don't think that necessarily is a problem. I think that the problem with focusing on extinction is that it leads to this kind of moral inflationism, where basically it just makes us bad at practical reason. So let me explain what I mean by that. And this will be familiar to a lot of the sort of people into ethics and decision theory here. When your decision theoretic calculus includes an outcome with so much disvalue, it can tend to swamp other considerations, leading to bad decisions. So actions that are dedicated to averting that negative outcome can tend to be prioritized regardless of how much chance they actually have of making a difference and regardless of opportunity costs. It can also lead to kinds of busy work where you want to do X because you have to do something and X is something. It conduces also to breaching constraints because dirty hands can be justified. And yes, let's remember FTX. In general, I think it conduces to, and we have an object lesson in this, moral visionaries, big inverted commas, taking a lot of power into their own hands without robust institutional structures. Now, this is the idea, that OpenAI was founded under, the notion that we alone can solve this problem. The future of humanity is down to us. And that, as we have seen, is not a good way to make collective decisions. Okay, but even if you're not a long-termist, you still have reason to care about avoiding extinction. And more capable AI systems may well pose other catastrophic risks that aren't existential. And even if my brief discussion put you off long-termism, which I'm sure it didn't, all of the big questions about how to address catastrophic AI risk would remain. So while I heartily encourage people to reject long-termism, I don't think it's going to make a ton of difference to the rest. Moral inflationism will be. Okay. So let's get on to a positive proposal. Okay. This is going to lead to both how we should think and how we should act with regard to catastrophic AI risks. I want to talk about a distinction between two different types of risks. I'll just call them type 1 and type 2. Type 1 risks are posed by existing systems and their relevantly similar descendants. Type 2 risks are posed by descendants of today's AI systems that are not relevantly similar. What do I mean by relevantly similar? So system B is relevantly similar to system A if we can, through studying A, learn more about B and have good evidence that we've done so. I'll call type 1 risks before the technological horizon, and type 2 risks I'll describe as being beyond the technological horizon. So type 1 risks basically involve extrapolating from existing systems. So it's kind of feasible for us, with our existing and ordinarily expanding scientific knowledge, to make verifiable progress on reducing those risks. It's about looking at the next generation, taking the autoregressive LLM architecture and thinking about, okay, what happens if we combine it with this, this, and this? What happens if we develop it we add more scale, more compute, and we get to the next level system? What will GPT-5 look like? Type 2 risks involve future systems that are sufficiently more advanced than the present day technology that it is practically much harder for us, with existing and ordinarily expanding scientific knowledge, to make verifiable progress on reducing those risks. Okay, this is not a temporal distinction. Okay, technological horizons are not temporal horizons. There could be a scientific advance tomorrow that moves us kind of beyond that technological horizon, that creates a paradigm shift. It could already have happened, right? It hasn't, but it could already have happened. And actually, it might even be quite likely that such an advance would happen in the next 5 years. I don't know, it's really hard to predict significant scientific advances. The point is not about timelines, it's about having the epistemic resources for judicious action, right? So it's about being able to figure out what you can actually kind of do and when you can know that you're making progress. Also, it's worth saying that obviously it's a matter of degree. It's kind of a functional distinction, and you can be kind of more or less to one or other end of type 1 or type 2. This helps us shift our attention to focusing on what we should worry about to what we should do, right? And that's the whole kind of focus of my whole talk today. One of the things that annoyed me most during the 2023 kind of discussion was that there are so many pieces, so many thought pieces, so many editorials, so many tweets, where people were basically saying, should we worry about AI? And the question was just, should we worry about it? And I think that's like, I have plenty enough anxiety and neuroticism in my daily life. I don't need it in my work as well. I mean, and as far as the actual kind of unstructured probability that rogue AI will kind of wipe us out, I don't know, like not zero at some time. I have no idea how to put a number on that, but I definitely think that if the point of last year's discussion was to say some people think that it will never be possible for rogue AI systems to wipe humanity out, and they're wrong, then I think that that point was well made. And I do think that there are some people who do kind of who are appropriate targets for that objection. So, there was an editorial in Science the other day by Jack Stilgo, a sociologist in the UK, who was saying that AI won't wipe us out. He didn't have any argument for it. It was just, he had a chat with some people, and people in the past have thought about that technologies might wipe us out, and they haven't yet. So this won't wipe us out. That's not a good argument. So, like, if that's who you're arguing against, then fine. That debate, I think, is one. But I don't care about that, really, because I want to know what to do. And for me, I think what to do, when you think about what to do, it really matters whether it's a type 1 or type 2 risk. And I think that many, many people, like everybody I've spoken to, has signed onto that form. And I see your brow furrowing, but you'll see I've got a slide to deal with your furrowed brow, Simon, in a moment. Like, systems that would pose such risks would be sufficiently different from present-day systems that it's hard to make verifiable progress on reducing those risks by studying existing systems. As an example, Anthropic, one of the foremost companies pushing the boundaries of AI research, describes these sorts of risks from rogue AI systems as kind of level 4, too speculative to basically work on now. They distinguish between those and level 3 risks that are essentially the kind of what I would call type 1 risks. So some catastrophic risks definitely are type 1, okay? So I think that chemical and biological weapons discovery, definitely that counts to me as a type 1 risk. And I'm not really talking about like manufacture. I'm talking about more like the EVO model. If you guys have seen this one, it's a big, that one actually is a selective state space model that is trained on DNA and RNA to produce kind of new molecules. I think that kind of approach to sort of, it's the same sort of thing happens with AlphaFold, to kind of discovering new candidate molecules, that definitely could lead to the discovery of some like horrendous threat. I think cyber threats are definitely type 1. So I think that we can definitely see a way from current systems to more agentic systems that enable the deployment of autonomous cyber attacks at scale that could permanently shift the offense-defense balance in cybersecurity. I'll talk a bit more about that. I also think that safety-critical accidents are possible in some respects, especially in terms of military and intelligence use of AI systems. So I think there are a lot of societal scale risks that are very, very severe that are type 1. I just don't think that the rogue AI type is. And obviously, there are also lots of other non-catastrophic, but also very serious type 1 risks. I'll talk about those in a bit. Now, some people think that more data and more compute will be sufficient to reach rogue AI. So that would then be a type 1 risk. Like it's just GPT-4, but like with $7 trillion of compute directed towards it and all the energy in the world. And all the data that you could possibly have, and that will get you there. Okay, this is like, I think I'd love to have this be the debate, right? Rather than the debate being, what's your unstructured probability that rogue AI kills us all? I'd love the debate to be, okay, how do you think that an extension of the existing architecture will get you to that? Like, what will be the features? Because I think that first of all, I think there's a kind of burden of proof, like given the stuff I said about reasoning and planning. But fine, let's have that discussion. But also, I think there's a dilemma here. Okay, so let's say that these bigger versions with more data and more compute, they're sufficiently similar or relevantly similar to existing systems, then they'd be pretty easy to control. Because the fact is that if your AI system requires, a data center the size of downtown Hong Kong in order to function, and so much energy that it's kind of more than like a whole city on its own, it's quite easy to cut those things off. The massive resource dependencies of vast sort of extensions of existing language models, even the ones that exist now, take a ton of energy and a ton of hardware. But okay, so let's say that we do the sort of the storytelling thing where we say that like, no. These AGIs, they'll prevent us from doing that because they'll know that we're coming for them and they'll delete the off switch or whatever it might be. That's fine. like if they're self-actuating and they anticipate us, but then they're just sufficiently different from existing systems that like nothing that we do on current systems is going to be particularly relevant to figuring out how to make them safe. Like if they can do that, then let's say we're going to talk about mechanistic interpretability. This is one area of AI safety research which looks at kind of understanding the underlying activations in a neural network in such a way as you can track them and how they correspond with behavior. And so you can anticipate the ways in which a model is going to behave and whether it's deceiving you and those sorts of things. But if we're going to posit that the model can just suddenly act on its own accord and decide that we're a risk to it and prevent us from shutting it off, then also it could just prevent us from, it could do fake activations. There's no rules to this game. We can just kind of make up whatever we want. And I really think that once you get to that point of it being self-actuating, super intelligent, anticipating us, it's just sufficiently different from existing systems, which really aren't like that we can't really make any progress by working on existing systems in reducing those risks. Okay, so why is it hard to make progress on reducing the risks that occur beyond the technological horizon? What are the problems here? Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that you can't get anything done. I'm just saying that there are very significant costs, okay? Much greater costs that are hard to justify given the uncertainty that you're actually making a difference. Precisely because you just don't have these key epistemic resources, okay? And I'm going to talk about opportunity and absolute costs. And these costs can be justified only if there's some good that you're doing that makes them proportionate. And if you don't know if you're making any progress, then you don't have any good to justify the costs. It's also really important, I think, we know that with these risks, sometime in the future, we're going to know more. We'll have systems that are closer to that. Unless you, and again, one can defend the view that at some point, we're going to hit a hard takeoff scenario where everything will happen very, very, very quickly. That's a view you can defend. I don't think it's super plausible when kind of actually set out. I think it's much more likely that we just know more about more capable systems, same way as we know a lot more about more capable systems now than we did 18 months ago. So we know we're going to know more, which is further reason to kind of be patient, wait and see, be cautious. Doesn't mean nothing useful can be done. But let's talk about some of the downside risks. So I think there's a big risk of pointlessness. And I think, like with the moral inflationism problem, I think you can get stuck into busy work that gives you the illusion of control, that does little, except for upset young minds, which, I see these poor kids on Twitter who are just constantly saying things like, I'm not going to get a beard before the singularity, woe is me, It's, and I think one of the biggest culprits here, I'm afraid, is paradigm-independent philosophical reflection on catastrophic AI risk of the kind made popular by Nick Bostrom, who I have a thing where, if anybody mentions Heidegger in a talk, which sometimes happens in philosophical discussions about technology, I'll always say, Forrest Nazi. Let's remember Heidegger was a Nazi. Let's remember as well that Bostrom has done and said really racist things. But beside that, I think that the philosophical work, it's it's not uninteresting. It reminds me of kind of scholastic debates about the nature of God. There is a difference between this kind of paradigm-independent philosophical reflection on catastrophic AI risk, especially type 2 risk, or specifically type 2 risk, that for the scholastics, their debates about the nature of God are never going to be resolved. I don't know, maybe if you think, of course, if you think that they'll discover the truth in heaven, then fine, but not for the rest of us. Whereas when it comes to thinking about the risks of future AI systems, we're just going to find out more when we know more, when we develop more capable systems. So here's my empirical conjecture. I just think it's very unlikely that useful insight, I should say, into type 2 AI risks will come from a priori reasoning alone. It's just guessing. And I think that you're very likely to get red herrings, and we see examples of this. So in Bostrom's work, you can really see the sort of, people really over-indexing on the role of reinforcement learning in AI, and the notion that any powerful AI system would be this really stupid, crude consequentialist. And so you get things like the Bostrom-Yudkowsky kind of paperclip maximizer. But now that AI is so language forward, and Simon and Nico have a nice paper on this, it seems much less plausible that they'll end up just being these kind of crude, silly maximizers that can't act with some sort of common sense reason. You can say to the model, build me some paperclips, but hey, don't go crazy about it. And it can kind of understand what that means. And this is the thing, even when you do guess right, and sometimes people do, and some people have an impressive ability to anticipate the developments in future technologies. I don't deny that. But the thing is, when we learn about the more capable system, we don't then keep relying, and there's no reason to then keep relying on your guesses. We just talk about the system that you made the accurate guess about. And it's like, okay, cool. But that sort of paradigm-independent insight has been superseded by actual knowledge. And it is all just guessing. And that is very, very hard to ground. Okay, very hard to disagree with. It's all, I think, of a piece with the kind of the scholastic work on the nature of God. So that, I think, is one big cost of working on type 2 risks. A related one is the problem of grift. So hundreds of millions of dollars, even potentially billions, are being invested on the back of concerns about type 2 risks. It's obviously so easy for people to use that as a means of kind of putting out one demo showing that GPT-4 can be induced to lie to somebody, and then take that to a VC and get yourself a really nice sort of $10 million seed round. This is a big worry. And this is just because you can't tell what's busy work and what's not. There's no way to measure success, okay? And there are going to be serious absolute costs. So some of these are overreaction costs. So, doomers giving up on life after spending too much time on less wrong. That's a real thing, especially in Silicon Valley. Would-be data center bombers, there are people who are taking this stuff very seriously. That's a concern. But also there are really significant side effects to some of the proposed public policy actions that have been considered as a means of reducing type 2 risk. I can talk about these all in more detail, but in particular, the anti-open weights crusade, the securitization of AI risk, the way in which people have operationalized the kind of the US-China competition in order to kind of to restrict possible risks, but also just kind of have brought in the whole National Security Council kind of policy group into AI decision-making in ways that I think will be on balance harmful. I think compute governance, this is a proposal that has been made that we could monitor the kind of training and deployment of more capable AI models by governing the data centers where they're trained. That I think may well have, I think it's worth considering, but it may well have excessive absolute costs in as much as it's going to involve sort of radical surveillance of what people are able to do on those systems. So there can be these really big costly side effects. And again, these substantial costs, they're just harder to justify when you don't know whether you're getting anywhere, right? That's a really big problem. And I think that what often happens is that people are kind of proposing some of these policies as though the motivation for them were kind of to deal with type 1 risks, when in fact the real motivation is to deal with type 2 risks, and the effect that they have on type 1 risks is not sufficiently great to justify their costs. There are also obviously opportunity costs. Now I want to be clear, I don't think that attention resources in this area are necessarily zero-sum. I think that you could totally work on catastrophic, type 2 risk, while at the same time providing sort of an appropriate amount of resourcing to dealing with type 1 risks. I genuinely don't think that the whole kind of argument that thinking about catastrophic risk at all is just a distraction from dealing with current harms, I just think is bunk. I do think that in practice, this is something that one has to consider, and the amount of time that you spend addressing type 2 risks, especially fruitless time, definitely could be used towards other more productive ends, and that's something you need to take into account. And it's particularly true on the policy front. And even more so, given that we will know more in the future. So the best strategy is probably to build up our capacity to deal with that knowledge once we have it. I think there are also big worries for dealing with type 2 risks about what I'm calling self-defeating costs. Same way as you can't tell whether an action is working, you also can't tell whether it's actually kind of working against you, right? And this is a big problem with this, because the big advances in AI safety research have undoubtedly increased type 2 risk. And I want to say, I think those advances in AI safety research are legit advances. When I said that about alignment before, I think it's a really significant achievement that kind of dwarfs the achievement of anything previously done in machine ethics to get language models to actually kind of both follow instructions, but also to be kind of so much less toxic. Even if it's not perfect, which it isn't, it's very brittle. But it's still a really significant achievement as far as making these models kind of productizable and usable. So it's a big deal. But at the same time, it has also led to a massive boom in AI research and where this kind of state of the art of AI development was in 2022 in the hands of companies that, whatever their flaws, you could tell really did have a pretty strong social mission. Now it's like, well, it's Elon Musk, isn't it? So for all that he's got Dan Hendricks there to be his Jiminy Cricket, I'm not sure that that's going to affect his decision-making that much. Yeah, and this goes back to that point about moral inflationism. I think that at the end of the day, people took the view with OpenAI that like only we can be trusted, only we can be the ones to see these risks and to deal with them. And so we need to kind of arrogate all of these power and resources to ourselves in order to manage them. And that, I think, has proved to be a big problem. It leads to a significant concentration of corporate power. And we've seen in the OpenAI governance crisis last year that the good intentions of sort of interpersonal morality that kind of drove their approach were very quickly kind of washed away by the $10 billion that Microsoft had invested in them. I think there's also a risk when you're working on type 2 risks that your work is going to be co-opted. And I think that some of the corporate actors who are building AI have an interest in emphasizing these kinds of risks. Because essentially they play the role of our protectors against those risks rather than necessarily the ones who are bringing them about. Like the rogue AI is the baddie, and Sam Altman is our defender. Because these risks do involve this element of the unforeseeable, they can escape a certain amount of culpability. They're much more plausibly culpable for type 1 risks because we can see where they're coming from. So they have a reason to favor type 2 risks. In the current normative landscape, I think we should change the normative landscape. All right, so those are the reasons why I think it's super hard to do kind of justified work on type 2 risks. What should we be doing? Okay, first of all, it doesn't mean that you don't do anything on type 2 risks. Like some approaches just don't have very big absolute or opportunity costs. And they might have low prospects of success, but whatever, like harmless enough. And it's worth clearly having a diversified strategy. So this means like, I think that, OpenAI, I've got a super alignment team. I think it's cool. I think they're doing interesting research. I think that if Open Philanthropy want to focus their philanthropic capital on these sorts of things, they should have at it. The opportunity costs are relatively small. There's lots and lots of resources going into AI research. I do think that because the prospects of success in this sort of work, when it has so little technical grounding, are like pretty small. So I think it's a good thing for that part of the research area to be quite small. But like, I think that that sort of thing should be totally fine. But on the whole, the best approach to dealing with type 2 risks is by making ourselves more robust at dealing with type 1 risks, the risks that we do understand and know about. Why is this good? It gives you a way of knowing whether you're making progress. It gives you something concrete, actual positive progress that you can weigh against any absolute costs. Obviously, it mitigates opportunity costs because you're actually looking at things in the light of what you can really achieve with them. And, best for the type 2 risks, it's going to provide you with robust and adaptable resources that you can use to deal with those risks when we know more about them. So I'm just going to talk quickly about institutions, norms, systems, and research communities. I know I'm near my time. Okay, so probably the sort of risks, like the more extreme risks from AI, like all other risks from technologies, are probably going to affect vulnerable populations first. This is just inference from the past. Like technologies generally are used to affect vulnerable populations first. They are like the canaries in the coal mine. Any measures that we take to protect vulnerable populations are likely to protect everybody. Transparency around type 1 risks is obviously going to be important, and it will help us deal with type 2 risks. So all of the policy proposals in the last little while that have been focused on transparency, I think, are really worth kind of developing. And I think that accountability is really a good idea. You can ensure that frontier AI developers are accountable for the harms that are caused by their systems, especially type 1 type risks. And like having robust liability laws would help with this. You may not notice the subtle reference, but this is fairness, it's accountability, that's transparency. That's the conference that I help run, fairness, accountability, transparency. Like these are good resources. I think that there are good initiatives. I like Anthropic's responsible scaling policy. I think that AI commissions and AI safety institutes, if they're well calibrated, are good. I think having intergovernmental organizations working on this, all this stuff is to the good. And it can focus around type 1 risks and put it in a position to deal with type 2 risks when we know more about them. I think that we should have a more robust public discussion on the risks of AI. And I think that in that respect, the last year has been really helpful. I think it helps a lot to start with the more tangible risks that actually we can know more about. And it can lead us into reflection on whether we should be allowing AI companies to run the type 2 risks. I won't talk about this because I'm close to my time, but I think that AI poses some really significant risks to democracy. And I think that that should lead us to be questioning the aim of building ever more powerful AI systems. And I think that even if we did manage to build what OpenAI aim at, safe, beneficial, and controllable AGI, then I think that would probably be incompatible with democracy. And I think that should matter for us now. I think we should be thinking about what we want these companies to be aiming at, whether it's okay for them to say, we're all out, all out for AGI on the assumption that AGI would be inconsistent with democracy, even if they were able to make it safe enough to not kill us all. So I think having that discussion around norms is really important and valuable. And obviously, we should be working to design safer AI systems now. I think empirical AI safety is a really important field. And I think that it's worth having something like safety cases for developing more capable systems, like David Kruger has advanced from the University of Cambridge, where essentially the idea is that if you can't build one system safely, then you shouldn't be entitled to build the next one. You should be able to make the case for the new system that you can actually deploy it safely before you get to go ahead with it. I also think that it's really important to do some work on the research communities that we have developed in order to deal with these risks. And I think that the existing community of research on AI safety has, it's young and it has sort of very understandable limitations, but it's time to kind of overcome them. And actually, I must say, I think progress is very much being made. I've been speaking with a lot of people lately who are sort of more from the AI safety side of things, if you like, who are clearly interested in doing the things which I'm about to describe and acknowledging the problems I'm about to describe. But still, they are there. It's very narrow ideologically. It's not sufficiently self-critical or reflexive. It definitely lacks an adequate understanding of power, not only corporate power, but especially that. Lacks diversity across pretty much every dimension. At times as well, the AI safety field is just not scientific enough. It ends up relying a lot on work that isn't peer-reviewed, on proprietary models that you can't get access to. And that isn't helped by AI safety people arguing against open weights models because you can at least do open research on open weights models. I think that we can advance AI safety by thinking more about what would happen even if we successfully resolve the most extreme risks, thinking about democracy, recognizing the inadequacy of these narrowly technical approaches to deal with these problems. We've seen this in every other field. You've got privacy by design, you've got fairness by design, you've got many other things where we try and incorporate some set of values by design. It's never sufficient on its own. You always have to have a socio-technical approach that takes into consideration the ways in which systems can be misused or abused, no matter how cleverly you design them. I also think it's really important that in kind of reconfiguring AI safety, we do recognize the value of the technical work that's been done. I'm calling for socio-technical AI safety, but it still has the technical bit in it, right? It's important not to just kind of wash that out, as I think some who are more on the kind of AI ethics side might be tempted to. Now, last couple of thoughts. I think that in thinking about these type 1 risks, we should sort of stop just focusing on the kind of the most catastrophic risks. I think it's worthwhile thinking about them, but it's not sufficient. We need to also recognize other risks that are kind of not necessarily societal scale, but very severe, or else not necessarily so severe, but they are societal scale. In particular, I think that we really need to take into account risks to democracy. We can debate. We're in Hong Kong, next to China. The value of democracy is obviously something one can disagree about. I think it's really likely that advanced AI poses very significant threats to the future of democracy in democratic countries. Obviously, people talk already about deepfakes and disinformation. I think that we should really worry about the internet becoming unusable because of all the crap on it. I think that AI is going to enable a radical expansion of surveillance, even beyond what we've already achieved with AI or what's already been done with AI in the last several years. I think it also promises to radically concentrate corporate power. The China Shock 2.0, this is the thesis that when China joined the World Trade Organization in 2002, it led to a massive amount of manufacturing jobs being shifted away from the United States, which resulted in loads of people being kind of rendered unemployed and as they felt, disenfranchised, and which created the environment that has enabled Donald Trump and the growth of authoritarianism in the US. like massive amounts of automation leading to that level of a sort of another significant displacement of work could have exactly the same impact and create a perfect environment for fascism. I also think it's worth considering the prospect that AI systems will permanently shift the balance in cybersecurity. This is between offense and defense. This is very much under dispute. No one really knows for sure. But I think that it's certainly a risk worth taking seriously. Is it a catastrophic societal scale? Would we all be like, should we consider like the possibility that all computers wouldn't be networked? Like, we wouldn't be able to network computers. Would that be a catastrophic risk? I don't know. Certainly, I think it's one that we should take into account. I think it would massively suck. And obviously, there are also severe but concentrated risks enabled by these more capable systems. And I really want to stress, these are all risks that are like, you know, novel risks that come about from significantly more capable systems, that if all you do is just study current harms from AI systems, then you won't actually get to these risks, because widely deployed systems aren't able to do this yet. But we're sort of getting there. And I think that, like, you know, the use of AI by the military in targeting, we're seeing at the moment in Israel how this is being done. It's really worrying. The degree to which Project Maven in the US has been accelerated, I think, is also very significantly concerning. Very worried about the use of LLMs in intelligence analysis. Very worried about how AI companions might enable a kind of radicalization and grooming to be conducted at scale in ways that, you know, like at the moment require like one-to-one relationship between actual people and could subsequently be fully automated. Like these, I think, are really, they're not likely to be societal scale in terms of everybody being affected by them, but they're very significant and they're novel, and like we need AI safety in order to address them. Okay, so what should we do? How do we wrap it up? Okay, so don't dismiss these risks, don't worry, but act, and act proportionately. I think that there really are some genuine catastrophic risks from AI that are type 1. I think the loss of control rogue AI type risks are type 2. I think there are lots of other novel, non-catastrophic type 1 risks that we need to pay attention to. So catastrophic risks from AI are not all hype. And also, we can't just proceed by focusing only on the harms from existing deployed systems. Like, that's not enough. And also, it's not something that we ever did before. Like, AI ethics work has always been about anticipating risks from systems that haven't yet been widely deployed. We should obviously act to address current harms, because it works. We have the resources to do it. This is just a no-brainer. There's no reason why this should be kind of part of the same discussion around catastrophic risks. They're not mutually exclusive. And we should act to address type 1 risks in a way that enables us to kind of you know, act proportionately and prepare for dealing with type 2 risks when we know more about them. Create the institutions, the communities, the norms that put us in a position to deal with them when we understand them better. And obviously this means that some work on type 2 risks actually is proportionate. Like, you know, if there are kind of minimal opportunity costs, minimal absolute costs, then have at it. And besides anything, people should do what they want to do. I'm not here to tell people what to research. Policy action, I think, involves more significant costs, both absolute and opportunity costs. That should, on the whole, be justified by type 1, not type 2 risks, if it involves those costs. And I think we should be especially wary of policies that would be justified only if one assumed that type 2 risks were type 1. Like, we should be really asking people about the risks that they're imagining, how they are, like how we can act on them, how we can know that we're making progress on dealing with them, given the difference between the systems that they're describing and the systems that we understand. Last thought. This, like, whatever else you take from this, if you disagree with me on anything substantive, like, I really don't think that we should focus on PDoom. I really don't think we should focus on timelines. I don't think we should focus on worry. I think we should focus on courses of action that are available to us and look at this particular action, think about its prospects of success, the good that it can do, and compare that with its absolute and opportunity costs. And I think that in order to do that, you really need to know whether the risk that you're trying to address is one that is before or beyond the technological horizon. And I think that if you do that, my bet is that this will lead to taking more action on risks from the technologies that we better understand, and a certain amount of caution and patience with respect to those that we currently don't. All right, that's all. And here you get to see the whole poem.
Fantastic. So questions, Herman, Simon, Rachel, and we'll start with them.
Thank you. That was super interesting, I think. I want to understand like two different strands in it a little bit better, maybe. So there's a part of this the way you're thinking about it and talking about it, that's like about what people should be thinking about and talking about. You had like a little remark at the end, it was like, I don't want to tell people what to work on. But it feels a little bit like, it's like policing of what people should be thinking about. So, you know, like I've been in a bunch of philosophy department and everyone's just been working on all kinds of weird stuff. Like, are we living in a simulation? Is expressivism true? What is grounding? I wrote my dissertation on quotation. None of it has any effect on anything. So I'm a bit worried about how some of these concerns about like, what's the effect? And we should do the thing that has the most impact now kind of thing. Not, that's maybe true enough for like if you're a venture capitalist or you're in a policy deciding position or you have some sort of like direct out-facing position. But for most of us who work in philosophy departments, that's just not what we do, and that's not what we're trained to do, and it's not what we're good at doing. So policing what we should be thinking about just seems kind of weird. So, but that's not really so I'd be happy with like, well, here's an argument against something that Bostrom said. Like, he has his argument that goes over 4 pages, it has 7 premises, and here's what I think is wrong with it. That's like one way to engage with it. And then there's another way, which is like, you shouldn't be thinking about this. And you're a little bit on that second path. Do you have some thoughts on that criticism? So here's another version of that. It's like, it kind of overgeneralizes so that 80% of what people do in philosophy departments, they shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, so I mean, I thought I was clear on this, but maybe not enough. Like the question is, are there absolute or opportunity costs? And like if you're just doing philosophy, then I don't see what the absolute costs and the opportunity costs are. I think in the case of, I did mention at the start of that philosophy slide on pointlessness, that there is this, you know, and maybe I could do more to tie this together. So one, like, it is affecting a bunch of people, like I said, the sort of the young minds being deeply upset. And that is a cost that one should take into account. I also think the fact that like a certain amount of that research has been kind of taken on board by people who are acting in the world does mean that there are kind of greater responsibilities that go with it. Like, so for example, I used to work on the ethics of war, right? And in this context, you're writing about a topic where your research is being taught to people who are going out and who are actually going to go and kill people. And so there is an effect that your actions have in that context where you need to be sort of conscientious and thoughtful about like what you're justifying, what you're arguing for, in light of the fact that it will have real world consequences. And I think that there is an element of that that's true around some of the Bostrom type work. I think it has had pretty significant real world consequences, and I think it is incumbent on philosophers in the same way as it's incumbent on computer scientists to think about the downstream implications of their research. But like that really is an empirical case that one has to make in a particular example. And the point that I'm making there is that like, if there are significant opportunity or absolute costs to what you're doing, then when you're working on type 2 risks, it's much less likely that you're going to be able to justify those costs. So in that sense, you know, it doesn't, like if one's just doing other stuff in philosophy where there are no absolute opportunity costs, wouldn't have any kind of bearing on that. Like there's nothing you need to justify besides how you use your own time, which, as I said, like, you know, people should do what they enjoy. But like, yeah, so I don't think it does generalize in that way. I think that there are some aspects of the particular kind of Bostrom style work which has had consequences in the world, which should give us pause in the same way as, you know, if somebody does some fundamental work in physics that ultimately leads to a significant new weapon being developed, that's something that they should be thinking about when considering their research. And I think that some work in philosophy does have some of those quite impactful implications in the real world, but that most of it doesn't.
Good. Like, I mean, I'm happy with that thought, but just to be clear, so your thought is not that people shouldn't be thinking about, well, suppose we have like the new Bostrom book about utopia. If we have this thing that can do all the work for us, and you're saying you could run the same argument here, right? Like, well, that's very unrealistic. We shouldn't be thinking about that. That's not, but that's like the kind of thought experiment that people have been running in moral philosophy and political philosophy for centuries. But
Yeah.
so is that another one of those? You don't think about that. Think about exactly what happens tomorrow and 2 weeks from now.
So what are the, I think the thing is, what are the costs that one is trying to justify in that case? And like, you know, if you're just writing a book that is like, there's no, like you're using your own time, which you're entitled to use however you want to. I think again, Bostrom, like his work does have consequences over and above. So I think he's a sort of maybe not the best case. If you were to think, Yeah, so if you think like whatever your book say, you know, like or my book, you know, like anything that one might write as a philosopher, which is unlikely to make that much difference to anything. Yeah, that's a personal question. Like this is that's small potato stuff. Like the question is like when significant policies are being developed and like significant resources are being allocated, when you could be doing something else at a significant scale that would be really good with those resources.
Okay, just
That's the issue.
so since that's not true about most of us,
Yeah.
we, you know, like it's going to have no effect and no one's going to care about it.
Among
We should just be
philosophers.
doing whatever we want to.
I mean, look, I think people should write what they want to write on, you know? Like, it's that, on that side, I'm really, this is addressed, like, the sort of target audience for this stuff is people like the AI Safety Institute, for example, you know? Like, folks who are actually making policy and making decisions in the labs as well.
Okay, thanks.
Simon.
Thanks so much for the talk. I wanted to clarify a bit more the target of the criticism. So I tend to think about maybe three different groups in the vicinity of technical AI safety who are trying to mitigate risk from rogue AI. So first group is like Bostrom, kind of like philosophy people who are really just thinking about like the bare nature of intelligence and agency, not engaging with data systems at all. Second group is organizations like MIRI and Redwood Research, who are also doing very speculative work that doesn't really engage with like LLMs, but they're engaging a bit more like they do think about like concepts in reinforcement learning and things like that. And most of them, you know, they tend to be very socially close with the, you know, with people doing the third kind of work that is still very focused. There's a group of people who have been doing work in technical safety that engages with frontier models, but is extremely oriented towards risks from rogue AI. And I wanted to understand whether your systems target that work. So I just wanted to give some examples of some of my favorite work in technical safety that I think has been really motivated by concerns about rogue AI, and just see what you think about it. So, you know, just as some examples, I really like some recent work on trying to design AI lie detectors from Colin Burns and some other people. So the dream of this paradigm is to, you know, be able to design like probes and other kinds of technical devices that can actually let you determine like the beliefs of a frontier model independent of what it says, so that, you know, you'll be able to identify cases where it says something, but actually it has an internal representation that's the opposite, and that counts as its belief. Well, what does that mean? You know, that's the research project. But a lot of the reason they're doing that is because they're thinking, well, it might be quite helpful once the models are more powerful and have potential to go rogue if we can just read, you know, read their minds. Another kind of thing in this vicinity is recent papers trying to use like concept deletion techniques to rein in models. So for example, can you take a super powerful model and just delete its concept of viruses? Then, then even if it tries to go rogue, it won't know how to make viruses. So another kind of thing is like trying to find like internal world models in, you know.
This is all great. So look, I can save you going through the other examples. That is all like just sufficiently justified by the degree to which it reduces type 1 risks. And I think the whole set of the agenda of empirical AI safety as this kind of like, I agree that like people are actually motivated by type 2 risks who do that work. And I think this is, you know, this is a fact of people's psychology. Like many of the people who do that work, they ultimately, like what they care about is really mitigating the really big risks. And these are the resources that they have available to them to do it. And I think that like they really are clearly going to be valuable for mitigating type 1 risks. Like the next generation of AI systems that operates in a more agentic way, we're going to need all of those, you know, those affordances in order to reduce the types of risks that they pose. So I think that that kind of empirical AI safety work, especially as done by teams that, and this is how Anthropic kind of describe their AI safety agenda, but also folks at OpenAI like Colin Burns. Like that I think is really interesting. That's the bit when I was saying that socio-technical AI safety mustn't lose the technical part. Like the technical part is really important. The MIRI and Redwood stuff, I think, is way more hit and miss. And I think that, like, you know, I mean, like again, there's a tricky thing when it comes to like people dispersing philanthropic funds. Like on the one hand, you want to say, well, like whatever, spend on whatever you want. You know, I'm not like an effective altruist, so I don't think that you should do the most good with the resources that you have. I do think that like gratuitously wasting it is bad. And I think that it's hard to argue that some of MIRI hasn't.
The claim is restricted to things like MIRI and Redwood, though. You know, I'm just confused because a lot of the people who work in technical safety, it's not just that like just merely causally motivation that care about rogue AI. Many of the paradigms that they're coming up with of how to investigate the models are extremely informed by thinking about this particular risk of an AI system, you know, going rogue. So for, you know, there's also stuff on like building building benchmarks for persuasion, deception, and power behavior.
Yeah.
There's a million different things where if they weren't thinking in terms of the lens of this system might go, a descendant of the system might go rogue. If they weren't thinking through that lens, they wouldn't be coming up with the same kinds of paradigms. They'd be having different kinds of breakthroughs. So I think it's not just that, like, well, they happen to have this motivation, but it doesn't inform like the results they have.
That's like an interesting empirical question, and I think I don't really, I'm not fully sure able to resolve it. I do think that if you're trying to, suppose that this research became significantly costly, like suppose that in order to do it, you had to run, which is kind of true, suppose that you have to do like a massive training run that is going to have significant environmental costs in order to carry out one particular part of this research agenda. So you're thinking at this point like, wow, we're going to be putting loads of resources into this, loads of environmental costs are at stake. What is the good that justifies doing that? I would say the good that justifies it is the one that you can actually kind of see in virtue of the fact that you can be confident that doing this sort of work is very likely to affect you, to help you with dealing with type 1 risks. I think that when we're thinking about how effective it will actually be at dealing with type 2 risks, it is pure speculation because the sort of systems that we're imagining being able to go rogue would be sufficiently qualitatively distinct that like you just have no way of knowing if what you're doing is going to be relevant to it, which most of them who are doing this kind of acknowledge. Yeah.
Think, the advice you're offering to future funds, Institute and Open or whatever, one of the key margins they're going to be intervening on is you've got these technical safety researchers. Are you going to fund people who have stuff that is directed towards rogue AI, or are you going to fund the people who are more directed to misuse? And I think I got a long list of extremely promising, technical, results that people have done in the last year that are directed at rogue AI. And I feel, the kind of argumentation you're doing seems like the causal effect it would have on the margin is moving away from that towards misuse. So I just don't have a good grip on it.
Yeah, so not specifically misuse. I mean, I think that many of the risks from agentic AI systems are not going to be, like, long before we get to anything like rogue AI going to kill us all, we're going to have the risk of an AI malware. Right, and I think that the techniques that they're developing are going to be relevant for dealing with AI malware. And I think that the probability that they're going to be relevant to that is way higher than they'll be relevant to dealing with rogue AI. So I think we just have way more things along the way. And also I think that like part of the point that I'm making here is that like in order to deal with the full kind of suite of type 1 risks, we also need to avoid being kind of myopically focused on just that one thing. So I think there are some great things in the technical AI safety research. But I think that there's also some significant limitations due to the sort of the myopia. And there I think that like taking that kind of work and integrating it more deeply with more of the kind of socio-technical work, I think would be really valuable. Just as one example, the way in which they're conceptualizing at OpenAI and the super alignment team, the work that they're doing is that their goal is to develop safe, beneficial, and controllable AGI. The idea of controllable is basically like desperately needs some account of like, would it actually be controlled? Like it's in principle controllable, but like, would it be subject to control by democratic institutions, for example? Like, is the kind of AI that you're imagining going to be something that real people in the actual world would be able to control? You can't think about that problem from a purely technical lens. You have to think about it from the broader, by incorporating the broader socio-technical lens. So on the one hand, I think that like the work that you're describing, which is in many respects, I think really interesting, empirical AI safety work, I think is best justified by, in fact, by appeal to the type 1 risks. And on the other hand, I think that like we will be better able to deal with both type 1 and type 2 risks by taking that body of work and opening it out to incorporate a much broader socio-technical perspective.
Just as a yes or no question, though. So current technical safety work that is focused on rogue, the examples that are focused on rogue AI as opposed to misuse, do you think on the margin should be less funding for that?
I dispute that it's focused. I mean, when we're talking about focus on rogue AI, I think you're talking about loss of control. I'm talking about, so the rogue AI that I'm talking about is the kind of rogue AI that was mobilized in discussions of catastrophic existential threat from AI systems. It was AI goes Terminator, wipes out humanity. The sort of loss of control. Well, no, because I think that loss of control from agentic systems that pose no threat to humanity but are going to be a real problem is really worth addressing.
Awesome. Our queue has now enlarged, so next we have Rachel, followed by Linus, then Fade and Herman.
Okay, well, maybe I'll just try and speak loudly.
I'll repeat the question too.
So I was think about like safety research more generally and maybe just stopping it altogether. And one thing you might think is that, okay, some of the things that scientists are thinking about, they actually they're meant to that are meant to address type 1 risks actually create more type 1 risks in trying to address those type 1 risks. But they also create what you might call like type 0 risks. Like they could have real harm in society now, just with technology itself. And I think like when a technology like nuclear power or something, or cloning a science, sometimes you just stop it. Right? You even stop the science and stop it from allowing to happen. And then one thing that sort of drives me in that direction is that, well, maybe the way to develop AI is to focus exclusively on deployment and those types of like actually like how to mitigate risk is not the right way to frame it. You should actually be thinking about how can AI benefit real people now and develop the AI so that it is addressing real problems that we have now, and that's the best way to create safe AI. Because we're addressing real problems and we're doing it in a way that just does that. That should be the aim, should be AGI, right? The aim should be to help people now and to develop tools to help people now.
Yeah, good. So just for the audience on the Zoom, I'll just try and summarize that a little bit. So basically, that there's an argument against, there's an argument for stopping this whole kind of agenda of AI accelerationism towards this sort of telos of AGI with a view to actually shifting AI around instead at focusing on actual problems that people have, because the work that is being done to make sort of future more capable AI systems safe is potentially harmful in itself and is enabling a really harmful system. And one way that you could sort of put some additional flesh on that would be to say that like OpenAI and Anthropic in the last year or two have come to the conclusion that they can't make progress on what they claim to be their goal of developing safe AGI without massively capitalizing. So taking in tons and tons and tons of investment for the billions of dollars of compute that they need. In so doing, they're creating an industry that concentrates power and might well be kind of immediately harmful. Certainly it's been a pain in the ass for people working in universities and education through enabling people to just kind of generate essays on the fly. And there are other kind of harms that are associated with it. So, this sort of the whole kind of teleological agenda of AI research is something that one should question. Look, I think it's perfectly reasonable to have that view. I certainly think that the notion that we should all be aiming for AGI is just like something that I find hard to fathom. I think that even in the best case scenario where we get AGI that doesn't kill us, I think that it's really hard to imagine how like life in that setting wouldn't massively suck in other ways. And I think that a lot of the kind of, a lot of the safety stuff is paired with a kind of utopian vision of what, and this is the Deep Utopia book that Herman alluded to, of what like life would be like if we had AGI, which I think is predicated on a sort of deep misunderstanding of human society and politics. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to take that view. I also think that it's, like I said in the talk, I think that like AI safety research has ended up being capabilities research, just as a matter of historical fact. And I think that this will go for the things that Simon was just mentioning as well. Like, it's also useful, to be able to know whether your Robocop is lying to you. If we're going to deploy AI agents to monitor and surveil and police people's behavior, we'll want the same kind of level of control. Well, I mean, I think that there are contexts where you would want it. I mean, there are some cool use cases. There's like, okay, so here's one of my favorite possible things that you might do with AI. This is not a big thing, it's just a cool thing. Someone did a paper where they showed how you could use AI agents to assess whether information was worth paying for before you as the owner see it. Because like the AI system can see the information, can assess it, and then can completely delete it. And that I think is cool. And look, I do think that So I think that, like, I take the point. I do think that increasing AI capabilities will lead to some really awesome stuff that will be beneficial in the kind of cases that you're thinking about. And I do think that, like, expanding our capabilities as humans through technology is just like, can be a really good thing. And I think that there are sort of versions of what are coming next that will be oriented towards doing good. I do think it's like, it's a reasonable question to ask though. And every time I talk about this stuff with folks outside of AI, they always say to me, you know, okay, so you've just described all of these bad things that might happen. Like, what are we getting out of this? Like, what's the good thing that we get as a result of this? And it is a little bit hard to see when the major kind of, you know, consumer or sort of human-facing offshoots of the most significant AI advancements in the last, you know, couple decades are just, you know, chatbots and image generators and things that you can use to make funny songs about your colleagues. Like, it does feel as though there is a mismatch between what we're actually achieving and the potential harms. I also do think at the moment, the actual harms from these systems are fairly small, you know? So I don't think that they are like the absolute pits right now. I think that the harms that we're getting from AI systems on the whole are much more from predictive systems being used by, especially by governments and by social media companies in order to make decisions that substantially affect people's lives. And so far, you know, LLMs haven't really gone into that space. But, you know, they probably will, and, you know, probably with bad effects that are pretty predictable.
Linus?
So my question is more kind of trying to pick your brain. So you do emphasize that we should focus on issues in AI effects that we have the knowledge now or coming close to having knowledge now to deal with. So what do you think are some of the issues are in that category that has not been paid proper attention?
Yeah, so this speaks to this sort of this question. Like, a lot of the big fight in 2023 between the kind of AI catastrophists of one kind and of another kind was around, like, stop talking about, even people are saying, stop talking about risks. Should be talking about harms, actual harms. Don't talk about this made up future stuff. Talk about things that are happening now. And that, I think, is just far too reductive, because I think that there's like yeah, I mean, we should absolutely talk about current harms. And we should be doing things about current harms, like I said at the end. That's like just, you know, that's like low-hanging fruit, essentially. And I think with a lot of the current harms from AI systems, what we essentially lack is, in many cases, political will. Like, we kind of know what we need to do. It's a case of operationalizing that. And I mentioned the Office of Management and Budget memo in the White House. That, I think, is just like a brilliant articulation of how governments should use AI and how they shouldn't use it. And it's like, now the question is, how do you get people to actually stick to that? As far as what you're aiming at goes, I think they've just done a really good job, and I think we basically know for the types of systems that they're considering. Now, I think that isn't adequate. Like, I don't think that's enough from the kind of the ethics or safety, or however we want to call it, side. And I think that one of the problems with the debate over the last year has been that it has kind of been polarized into these two things. There's that on the one hand, and then there's the really extreme, especially futuristic type risks on the other hand. And I think that there's like slightly less futuristic risks over the next 5 to 10 years from the widespread deployment of GPT-4 plus level systems that I think are going to be really, really consequential. So most of my current work is focused on AI agents based on language models. So I call them generative agents. I think that these are going to be used in loads of different areas in society, and they're going to have really significant impacts. And we see the kind of leading edge of that with AI companions now, but we're going to have like a completely new paradigm for personal computing, where instead of having apps and, like, you know, having to know how to code or whatever, you can basically just command your digital technologies through an agent that then also acts as your kind of filter to all of your digital life, an intermediary. Like, I think that's going to be really significant and involve, you know, it's important. Like, I think it has important positives to it. I think it will shift power away from the platforms, right? At the moment, digital platforms have a significant degree of control over our attention because you have to go to the platform in order to get the stuff that you want, the content that you want. If you can have an agent that goes there on your behalf and gets you the stuff that you want, it can apply a recommender system that is actually kind of, you know, conforms with your values through a kind of a natural language interface that you exchange with it, and you tell it what you want it to do. without relying on mass surveillance. So I think there's good stuff there, but there's also risks. Like if that is instead done by, by Google, then they've got like a little avatar in your life that knows even more about you than the implicit knowledge that is distributed over all the various kind of data brokers that currently exist, and that can potentially influence you in really significant and problematic ways. So I think that and in a way, this is where I think the field of AI safety is really important and is a really important, I think this is all AI ethics, because I think of ethics in the way that philosophers think of ethics, like what we ought to do. And then AI safety is a subset of it that focuses on direct risks essentially from autonomous AI systems acting without direct supervision. I think that's what makes it a question of safety rather than something else. And I think that it's safety as well because it's about risks, not about like what your positive things that you're aiming at, about avoiding harms to rights. And I think that's a really important thing that you want to do because there's a minimum condition for developing these things. You want them to be safe in that respect. And I think in order to do that, we need to bring in all of this other kind of thinking about the kinds of risks they'll pose when they're actually being used. So yeah, and I think that that area is the bit that we're currently just kind of whiffing on. Although, like as I said, I spoke with one of the co-founders of the AI Safety Institute in the UK the other day, and like they're very much kind of onto this as being something that they need to be doing more on. And I think that like as the field of AI safety comes more to the center of public attention, it's already naturally evolving to incorporate more of these types of concerns. And one of the things that I think is a risk, and this is sort of inside baseball within the AI ethics type area, but like one of the things that I think is a risk is that AI ethicists are so sort of, I don't know, like ideologically or like tribally opposed to having anything to do with something that says AI safety, that they fail to contribute at a really important time to a set of really important debates.
Faye.
So my question probably is a bit similar with past questions. So we can imagine that there may be a scenario situation in which that in order to mitigate one kind of type one risk, you might have impact or provide or like prohibit reducing or mitigating another kind of type of risk. So for example, we know that for AI to be accurate or avoid errors, we need a massive data, in a diverse way. But on the other hand, we want to protect privacy and cybersecurity. So can you imagine there's probably some kind of conflict between reducing risk of cyber security, but meanwhile, what effect of collecting massive data to train AI to be as accurate and less error as possible. So, and maybe imaginably, you could also imagine a scenario in which that in order to mitigate a type 1 risk, you might also have an impact of a negative impact of mitigating a type 2 risk. So do you think among those different type of risks or kind of risk within the same type, there's a kind of hierarchy, or is some kind of risk that's important than other? There's a conflict we should prioritize risk over the other, or you think they're just parallel and you don't think there will be any conflict, right?
Yeah, okay, good. So the question basically is, what does my approach sort of say about conflicts among mitigating these different risks when the measures that we might take to address one might work against another or might exacerbate another? So my theory doesn't really say, like, the thing that I've offered here is a distinction between sort of, and a degreed distinction between like risks that are posed by systems that we relatively well understand and those that are posed by systems that are qualitatively different from those. And I think that like, all it basically says is that if you think there's some chance that mitigating a type 1 risk might exacerbate a type 2 risk, then your degree of uncertainty about the nature of the type 2 risk should sort of discount that particular feature in your calculation of proportionality. So like that's kind of the only concrete implication it would have. And like this does lead to actually like practical implications, right? So for example, having people think that we shouldn't allow the release of like Llama 3 405B's weights because they're worried about how that might contribute to a type 2 risk of rogue AI taking off. I don't know the causal story of how that would work, but that is a motivation that people have. And like the release of Llama 3 405B's weights is probably going to be the most kind of consequential piece of kind of research material for doing like safety and alignment research as people who aren't within these companies, because like it gives you a GPT-4 level model that you can actually kind of play around with. And so yeah, there is clearly a kind of a balance there. I think there's a more generally, I think there's a really interesting set of questions around safety research. Leave aside type 2 risks entirely, where like a bunch of stuff that we're doing is sort of like gain of function research. And that's interesting. Like, you know, I mean, we have sort of standards that are cover and limit gain of function research for, you know, biological stuff. I don't think we have them for AI research. I've got a project that I'm really excited to do that is definitely gain of function research. It's about creating a double agent, so a companion that is like extremely good at exfiltrating your information and manipulating you after building up a relationship of trust and kind of mutual support over a long period of time. So the idea is to do it as a longitudinal thing. And it's like definitely problematic as a thing to do. But I think really important, because I think we actually need to know what these models are capable of in order to know how to calibrate the types of interventions that we make in order to prevent that from being done by unscrupulous actors. So I do think that it is like there are tons and tons of conflicts. The one you mentioned is like a sort of, you know, between privacy and accuracy is like a, you know, that's table stakes. I think there's loads where you could end up doing something that is, you know, that proves to be directly harmful and unsafe. And I just think it's a really interesting thing that like I need to sort of have a proper think about in order to figure out how to deal with it. Like the way I would approach it would ultimately be looking at the, you know, the costs and benefits in more or less the way I described, but it's not super informative until you actually get into the detail of what the costs and benefits are.
Awesome. Next we have Herman, and then another person. So Herman, and then okay, so 3 more.
If anyone else has not asked the question.
Oh, then we could go straight to you then. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Hi. I'm probably your regular layperson. I'm your retail consumer of AI. So for me, talk about concerns of AI is akin to locking the stable when the horses have already bolted. So in one of your slides, you said, it's hype, it's not all hype, we should act appropriately. So how exactly should we act appropriately?
Look, so I think that, so as a consumer in particular, how should we act appropriately? I mean, look, I think that there are, the sort of concerns that I'm talking about are for the most part from systems that either haven't yet been widely deployed, or the ways in which they've been deployed haven't yet sort of realized their potential capability. So I would say that my primary focus right now is on, like I said, is on agents. And there are no, like, there's no decent agents that you can use in any significant degree that are sort of have any significant degree of kind of actions that they can take as a consumer. Like the sort of, the best thing is this software engineer called Devin that like only a few people have access to. So like as a consumer, I think that the kind of concerns that one should take into account are more the ones around like current harms and dangers. And I think like look, one thing that is, I think, probably not widely enough recognized and understood is that anybody who is a kind of enterprise level consumer, so if you're going to be deploying these systems in some way within your business, is that the risk, the sort of the security risks that they pose, or rather the security risks that they face, insofar as they are vulnerable to various different types of cyber attack, have not, I think, adequately been either addressed or publicized by people who are actually kind of selling these products. So I think, you know, going back to Rachel's point about the ways in which these systems are currently causing harm, on the whole, like, you know, there are certainly aspects of it, but not a ton. I do think that if people start to rely on systems based on LLMs for any kind of critical function within businesses, then their vulnerability to cyber attack is just going to sort of skyrocket proportionally to that. So I would say, like, don't trust them. Yes, don't use them for anything critical, you know? Like on the whole, just don't like treat them as an untrustworthy double agent.
Just like saying, don't clone human babies.
Well, no, but I think that like they are, you know, you have the option right now. It is available to you if you're a business owner to like deploy a chatbot and to have it represent you in, you know, in discussions with your customers. And if you do, it will make stuff up and get you in hot water. So like the basic point about not trusting them in any kind of critical setting, I think is actionable advice. But that's very much based on existing LLMs and where they're at right now. Whereas most of what I'm talking about here is the kind of the next generation, if you like.
Awesome. In our queue left is Herman and Simon. Is there anyone who hasn't asked a question yet that wants to ask a question? Oh, Elise.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this talk. I learned so much from it, knowing not that much about AI and having been convinced to become a Zoomer by Simon yesterday. This was a very helpful anecdote. So I also found the type 1, type 2 distinction really helpful. I guess I wondered if like one potential upshot of it was that we should also spend more time and resources trying to figure out how to classify whether risks fall into the type 1 bucket or the type 2 bucket. Because you can imagine there will be like clear cases or there's type 2 risks. We should definitely not try to address those right now. There will be also clear cases where there's type 1 risk, but there will also be a lot of like borderline cases. So one thing I think you mentioned when you presented the distinction was that it can be like epistemically difficult to tell whether we're like beyond or before the technological horizon. So like throughout these like borderlines, and also like related to your response to Simon, there might be an incentive for some people to sell their work as addressing type 2 risk when it's actually addressing type 1 risk. So there's sort of like epistemic and motivational difficulties in trying to sort these. So I just wondered, like for these, I assume there will be borderline cases. So for those borderline cases, like to what extent should we be trying to just you know, do what we can with them, or should we just first try to classify which bucket these risks go in?
Okay, good. So just for the Zoom audience, although I think that was probably audible, like, yeah, so what kind of work should we actually do on figuring out which risks fall into which bucket? Look, I think it's an interesting question. I think that my basic theory of the case is that if you're like, people can be motivated by whatever they're motivated by. Like some people are doing this sort of work because they want to hasten the arrival of Jesus. Like it's fine. Like their personal motivations are just for them. If you're making a case to justify the research in some context where there are some costs that need to be justified, I think if you're focusing your research on addressing a particular risk, you should be able to offer a causal story for how the system the kind of system that you're operating on would contribute to that kind of risk in such a way that it should be a concern of the kind that you're describing, right? So for example, like I was saying, if we've got AI systems that are relevantly similar to current systems, in order to get to the level of, of AGI, we're talking about having, like multiple gigawatt data centers being used to train them, like massive amounts of resources. And we're talking about systems that, like current systems, they don't by default self-actuate. Like they don't decide to do stuff on their own and just go about and kind of get motivation to do stuff. So you've got to provide a story for like, how is it going to be the case that the sort of thing that you're considering would come about from an existing system? If it's like one of those stories where it's step 1, step 2, profit, step 1, step 2, AI wakes up and goes boom, then it's like, fine. Doesn't mean that one shouldn't, that doesn't mean that you can't justify that sort of work in the event that it involves costs. It just means that there's like that, that uncertainty is something that should make us sort of cautious about putting too much weight on it. And like, if it's a matter of a research agenda, and it's the private resources of whatever, a philanthropist or a company, they should do what they want to do for the most part. If it's like, well, actually, no, we're not talking about a research agenda, we're talking about a policy, and that policy is going to prevent people from doing stuff that they really want to do, that otherwise they would be perfectly entitled to do, then that, I think, is a problem. So, like, I think that's where I think that like, it's definitely worth having work done, and it's about describing the causal story for how the sort of system that you're working on would generate that kind of risk. And making that the focus rather than just like the unstructured probability that at some point in the future we will develop AI systems that could pose such a risk. Because like and I think that really all of the discussion around, and I sort of pressed some individuals who signed the original, the case statement on risk. Like the discussion was really, really deeply ambiguous between those two things. And I think that that is just a mistake for deciding what to actually do rather than what to worry about.
Herman?
I think there's a little bit of a follow-up. So, and it's more about just how to draw the distinction between type 1 and type 2, because it's kind of a high-level characterization of it, relevantly similar, and now you just gave a more, meat on the bones and specific causal story. But even there, what counts as a sufficiently detailed story is going to vary between people, their research project, their funding, their position. So here's a picture for you that I'm wondering if you're happy with. Type 2, type 2 distinction is going to vary between people depending on your interests and your resources and your projects, and whether you're in a philosophy department. Maybe in a philosophy department, type 1, type 2 blend much more together. It's, I can see a way. It's computing, and I have this very abstract notion of computing, and I can see how through computing we can get to something without telling you a detailed story. That's sufficiently relevant, similar to me. So what's type 1 risk for me won't be a type 1 risk for someone who's actually working in a company with a deadline to produce something. So
Yeah.
you have the kind of like variable distinction where the relevant similarities do a lot of the relevant part.
Yeah, okay, good. So the question is essentially that we could think about the distinction between type 1 and type 2 risks as being dependent to some degree on what you're trying to do and on what your kind of level of understanding might be, or the level of abstraction that you're operating on. Yeah, so I have given a pretty functional account, and like this is an early stage of this talk, and I want to kind of try and get it's become more detailed as I've given this a couple of times, but it's still very kind of functional. I suspect that it won't vary in quite the way that you describe. I think I'd be more inclined to say that from the perspective of the philosopher, like you're held to the same empirical standard of like, look, how is it that the system that you're positing is going to pose this risk relates to anything that we can actually study? And if it's only at the very sort of high, well, it's also computing, then I think that like that, the point is here, how much signal are we getting that we can use in the justification of costly action? And I think that at that level of abstraction, we're just not getting a lot of signal that we can use to justify costly action. Now, of course, for the philosophers, if what they're doing is not very costly, it doesn't matter. But the point is that it's fine to do pointless work if you're a philosopher. People should do what they want to do, and if it's valuable to you, then it doesn't matter if it's pointless with respect to actually reducing AI risk. But the point isn't that like there's a different version of type 1 versus type 2 in that case. I think that the version should be on the basis of the best science that we have. What can we know about the type of system that would pose such a risk? And how does that relate to the types of systems that we can actually study? And in that respect, I think that's not something that would be, so moving to a higher level of abstraction, it involves computing, would still face the same problem of providing us insufficient signal to justify costs.
That's like a normative claim. Because it's just like you think this is the distinction we ought to do. And somehow having this more flexible picture, you think we ought not.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is this is a normative claim because I'm talking about situations where we have to justify costs. And if we don't have to justify costs, then fine. But if we do have to justify costs, then I think that yes, it needs to be based on the best science rather than, or rather, it should be based on the best science and the most informative science. And like, as I said, at a higher level of abstraction, it might be kind of true, or sort of like it might be true at that level of abstraction, but it gives us relatively little signal with which we can use to sort of generate a case for the proportionality of undergoing costs.
Fantastic. We have just enough time for one last short and sweet question from Simon.
I think one of my biggest reasons is I think in this ideology, I think rogue AI is a type 1 risk because I think that there's lots of work we can do on systems that lowers the risk of rogue AI. And I think that for two reasons I want to understand. The first reason is I think that AGI, there's a significant chance that AGIs could go rogue. And I think there's good reason to think that work on current systems will inform how AGIs work. If that weren't the case, then I feel because all the, like, as you've said, all the top AI labs right now are trying to make AGI, and they think that the work they're doing on their frontier models right now is productive to make AGI. So I feel surely, if they're right about that, then also doing safety work on frontier models will be relevant to how safe the AGIs will be, and then if AGIs go rogue, whether they'll go rogue. So that's the first reason. Second reason is that I think in practice there have been dozens or hundreds of really interesting papers on frontier models today that are extremely relevant to rogue AI, including the ones that I mentioned before. And I think many of the insights, not including NEARI style things, that, work that's being done on frontier models, I think there have been insights that are quite relevant to lowering risk from rogue AI, including getting a grip on how to measure what goals an AI system has, getting a grip on how to measure what beliefs they might have, how to measure whether they're power seeking. I just think there's a million things that have been done that have been productive about rogue AI. So that's why I think it's a type 1 risk.
Okay, so the claim is that type 1, like rogue AI is a type 1 risk because it's something that will come about from AGI, and the current systems are being developed, or rather the companies that are trying to develop AGI are trying to do so by scaling current systems. So look, this is where my point about, it might be true that this work is relevant to resolving harms from rogue AI. I don't think we have any basis to know that now. We certainly know that it's going to be relevant to addressing harms from sort of somewhat more agentic systems that will come kind of like down the path. Like I think they're like pretty confident of that. I just don't think that we have anywhere near enough evidence to say that it will be relevant to reducing risk from AGI rogue AI systems. Simply because like if we're positing, like, and this is where it's really important, like one doesn't just say, I'm asking you to sort of not just say like, well, AGI can generate rogue AI risk on the basis of like an a priori kind of claim. The point is like, okay, we're saying we're gonna scale existing systems, right? So we're talking about the next generation, so GPT-5. Nobody, I don't think, really thinks GPT-5 is going to be AGI among the people that you're describing, so just on the basis of testimony. But let's say, 2 more iterations, and we're talking power laws here, right? In terms of the way the scaling laws work. So like this means you got to go up an order of magnitude of compute basically each time. We're talking about systems that are sufficiently similar to current systems. Again, we're talking about multiple megawatt data centers, and we're talking about massive energy reserves. So what I'd want to hear is like, how do you think that a system which is essentially the same in architecture as current systems is going to get out of control and pose a catastrophic risk to humanity on the basis of kind of that kind of a scientific understanding of what these systems can do? And I just don't think that the case can be made. I think there is just this sort of ... foom, or ... it wakes up and something happens like that. And I think that like, fine, once we have that claim, that at a certain point the AI just wakes up, it knows it's being trained, and it is able to deceive us, then I think all of the work that has been done so far, there's absolutely no reason. I mean, for one thing, the AI is going to know that all that work has been done, right? So if we're going to play this game, that's what I talk about. There's a game like of the AI can just kind of have these powers that we're just positing for it. Then it's going to know all of the measures that have been taken antecedently. And if it is able to wake up and be self-actuating, then it is going to, like, why wouldn't it be able to also mitigate those measures and deceive in a different way, what have you? And the point that I'm making is essentially that, like, if you're, like, the thing that you're positing, the kind of the capability that would emerge at that level of scale is sort of radically different enough from where we currently are at, that, like, I just don't think there's any reason to be confident that the work that we do now, motivated by mitigating those risks, will actually be relevant. I think there is good reason to be confident that it will be relevant to mitigating risks of less capable systems, like using the LLM as the executive center of an agent. And like the important thing as well there is that, like, as far as maybe you and I go, Simon, or people who are working on these things, that is an area where I think that most people can probably agree, and where there's like a lot of productive exchanges that can happen. And I think that if people are then further motivated by the fact that, like, ultimately what they really care about is the rogue AI risk, like that's cool. Like, some people can be motivated by different things. I think that the productive area of research activity, and here this is a little bit policing boundaries, but like just in terms of like, okay, talk about what I want to do. I think the productive area for one to work on is that area in between, where it's like, the next generation systems, more agentic, all of these measures that we take on current systems, we have a reasonable chance, pretty high chance that they're going to be relevant to them. So we've got some real delta in what we're doing, and like the stakes are really high, because long before we get to the rogue AI risks, there's going to be so many other like inshitifying risks that we're going to deal with that are just going to make life progressively worse. That maybe by the time rogue AI wipes us out, it will be a blessing. So I think it's really worth addressing those intermediate risks.
Okay. Thank you so much. Let's thank our speaker.
Thank you for the questions. I'll unplug.